early 2005, there was a news story that some of you may remember. It was out in East Moline. There was a young high school girl named Adrienne Reynolds. She was new to Black Hawk College Outreach Center's GED program in East Moline. And being the new girl at that school that year, she attracted the attention of some of the young men in the high school that she was attending. And that was something that enraged another student by the name of Sarah Kolb. Sarah Kolb was envious of the attention that Adrienne Reynolds was getting from the boys at school. Now you would think this wouldn't be that big of a deal, but Sarah Kolb in fact threatened to kill Adrienne Reynolds out of envy. And in fact, in January of 2005, Sarah Kolb and another young man named Corey Gregory kidnapped Adrienne Reynolds. They took her. They took her out in the field and they killed her. She strangled Adrienne with a belt out of envy. People in this part of our state were shocked that this could happen among high schools. The body was burned and it was found in a farm in Mercer counties. They had done all kinds of horrible things to her. The body was found in parts of Black Hawk State Historic Site, in Rock Island, and on the Kolb grandparents' farm. A young man named Sean McKittrick was interviewed by ABC News. And he was with Reynolds and Gregory and Kolb on the night when Adrienne Reynolds was killed. And he told the affiliate WKQAD in East Moline, he said, "I didn't think that my friends were capable of such a thing." He said he was in the car with those three others. They were in a Taco Bell parking lot that night. And he said that Sarah Kolb started yelling at Reynolds, pulling her hair. He said, "I wish I would have took her with me," referring to Adrienne Reynolds. "If I knew something like this would have happened, I would have pulled her out of the car with me." I want you to keep that statement in mind, because you're going to hear about a situation like that the character of Judah runs into in the story that we read for this morning. All of his violence, his rage, his hatred, all over envy for the attention of high school boys. The story that we read this morning underlines the destructive effects that envy has on our behavior. It is the story of Jacob, which we have been following in Genesis. It's a story about how God chooses and preserves a people despite what we read about this morning, a ruthless, destructive family dynamic that often has little regard for people's good, people's value. This story, Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah, have children, but as I said, Jacob loves Joseph and Benjamin, his two sons, more because they are born from Rachel, whom he loves more. Now, we all know as parents that if you're a parent, it's not good to favor one child over another. But I also think it's also impossible to love each child equally because they are different people. You love your children differently because they're each different. But despite that, you try not to favor one. And if you do, there is resentment that grows. That's what's taking place in this passage. Everybody knows that Jacob's favorite son is Joseph. And in fact, Jacob makes no bones about it, and he gives Joseph this very special coat as a way of signifying that Joseph is his favorite. Now there's a debate about the nature of this coat. It's not exactly clear what the Hebrew word means when it describes the coat. It could mean that it's very colorful. It could mean that it's very ornate. It could mean that it has long sleeves. I don't think we're ever going to quite settle exactly what it was about this coat that was so visually attractive. But the intent in giving Joseph this coat is very clear. Joseph is special. He's better. And the irony of this story is that in some ways, Jacob turns out to be right about that. I know that doesn't sound right, but wait till you hear how this story turns out. Joseph's brothers all know that Joseph is the favorite. All 11 of them know. I mean, Jacob likes Benjamin real well too, but the rest of them he doesn't like as much as those two. And they all understand that Jacob favors Joseph. Now, in that culture, that would have been out of line. It would have been inappropriate. In that culture, the favorite brother is supposed to be the oldest one. He is the one who will get the largest portion of the inheritance and control over much of his father's estate when the father dies. Oldest brothers were often favored in that culture. That was the way it worked. And yet Joseph is number 11 out of 12. So Joseph isn't anywhere closest to being the oldest. He's one of the youngest. So you can imagine that kind of stuck in his brother's craw a little bit. It was so bad that when they were together, they couldn't even get together and talk without getting into an argument. Joseph and his brothers. Now, if you were Joseph and you knew this was going on, and you knew that your father favored you, and you knew that was a source of resentment among your brothers, you might want to figure out a way to diffuse that. You might want to say to them, I realize that Dad feels this way. I just want you guys to know that I don't think of myself as any better than you. And you might want to figure out a way to diffuse this situation. But instead, in this story, Joseph seems to dig his own grave deeper. For at some point in the story, he has this dream about him and his brothers working out in the field during harvest time, and they're picking sheaves of grain from the field that they've been growing. And for whatever reason in this dream, their sheaves of grain bow down to his sheaf of grain, which who knows how sheaves of grain bow down, right? But they bow down to his. And of course, instead of just being quiet about this, he goes to his brothers and says, yeah, you guys are never going to believe this dream I had. And he tells them about it, and his brothers scoff at him, as you would expect. And they say, you're never going to rule over us. You're one of the younger ones. You're never going to rule over us. As you read in Genesis, those words become famous last words. Later on, he has another dream. And in this dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bow down to Jacob. They bow down to him. Now, symbolically, that is a symbol of his mother and his father and his 11 brothers. So now his mom and dad are going to bow down to him too? You've got to be kidding me. And of course, instead of keeping quiet about this premonition, this dream that he's had, Jacob tells everybody. And his father lays into him. Because it's inappropriate to say things like this. It's disrespectful in their culture to say this kind of thing. He shouldn't have even mentioned this dream that he had. And because of this second dream, his brothers hate him more than they ever did. There's this tremendous acrimony, hatred between these brothers. And they're supposed to be the ones that God is choosing to bless the rest of the world through. So this isn't sounding very good. Later on, Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers. For whatever reason, Joseph isn't working with his brothers. It's like he's so favored that he doesn't have to go out and tend to the livestock like his brothers do. And so Joseph is sent out to check on them. You can imagine how well that went over too, right? There's a number of stories about what happened next. And what you read in Genesis is an editor's weaving of these different traditions about what happened next. The story's a little funky sometimes. It doesn't quite always follow. So it's clear that there are different traditions being woven in here. His brothers are watching over the herds of livestock, and when he is sent out, Joseph's brothers see him in the distance walking, coming to see the guy who was staying home and didn't have to work like that. So while they see him coming, they hatch this plan. They're going to take him and throw him into a pit out there in the field where there's no water, there's no way of him getting out. And he would just die probably of dehydration in a couple of days. Then they were going to take that coat of his and they were going to kill a wild animal or one of their animals and put the blood on it and go back home and tell Jacob, you know, Dad, we're really sorry, but poor Joseph, he got attacked by a wild animal, and he got killed, and here's the coat, because Jacob doesn't have DNA testing back then. He doesn't know. They say, look, you know, when we do this, let's see what happens to these dreams that he had about us bowing down to him. How ironic is that going to be, right? But what they're planning amounts to murder. They're not just leaving him somewhere. They're murdering him out of envy. One of them, the oldest, named Reuben, has a little bit of a conscience about this. And he's supposed to be in charge. He's supposed to be the guy who the other ones listen to. And so in this attack of conscience that he has, he plans to double-cross his brothers. He's going to rescue Joseph when they don't know about it. He says, you know what, why don't we throw him into this pit? But later on, he's like, you know what, I'm going to sneak back in and I'm going to pull him back out and take him home. That way we won't have to deal with the guilt. So his brothers take Joseph's coat from him and they throw him down into this pit. And it's odd in the story because Reuben seems to disappear for a while. Another one of Joseph's brother named Judah. Judah was the one whose family became royalty, gave birth to King David and King Solomon. Judah's conscience is also eating at him because he knows this isn't right. I don't care if Joseph's the favorite, it isn't right. Judah should have done the right thing after Reuben left. He should have taken Joseph out of that pit, and since Joseph was in danger, he should have just taken him right home to his father. You remember what I said about the young man in the car with the two girls who were arguing? What would have happened if he would have done what was right? What needed to be done? That's what Judah should have done. He should have pulled him out of that pit. But he doesn't. And instead of doing that, Judah and his brothers see these merchants coming down the road. They have goods that they're traveling. And of course, the land that they're living in is one that you travel through to go between Africa and other countries in the Mediterranean. So Judah says, I'll tell you what, let's sell Joseph as a slave. That way we don't have the guilt of killing a family member. His brothers agree with him. Later on, Reuben comes back to rescue him and sees that there's no Joseph in the pit. And the brothers don't tell him. They don't tell him that they've sold Joseph to these people who put on Egypt. Reuben is distraught. He thinks that Jacob will hold him responsible. He's right. As they had planned, the brothers take Joseph's coat back to Jacob. They tell their father that his favorite son has been attacked and killed by a wild animal. The pain that Jacob feels is immeasurable in this story. And it is all rooted in envy. You know, in this story, nobody has to harm anybody. Nobody has to do anything terrible to anybody. You may resent the favoritism that was being shown, but nobody has to hurt anybody. These brothers, it's not that they were going to lose out. In their history, they ended up being as revered figures. Even though Jacob loved Joseph more, these brothers ended up being the patriarchs of 12 tribes of Israel. It's not like they lost out. It's not like they really missed out by Joseph being favored. But there was this feeling that Joseph had something they wanted, even if it was just their father's favor. Today, envy is as alive and as destructive as ever, as the story I told you in the beginning illustrates. It has destructive effects. Let me ask Willie, put a couple of points I want to say about this on the screen. First of all, envy causes us to hurt the people we love, which makes no sense. The brothers caused Jacob and Rachel to grieve as though Joseph had died. The grief of a lost son or daughter. The pain that they felt, all for nothing. His brothers made their parents suffer that. It causes us to hurt the people we love. Sometimes when we are envious of something, we tell our family and friends little lies because we envy their attention. And when they find out that what we're saying isn't true, it is hard to measure the hurt. There's a syndrome that has been found, especially in the last 50 years, called Munchausen syndrome. And there's a second part of that called Munchausen by proxy. In this syndrome, an adult, especially by proxy, makes a child sick so that they can get the attention of medical staff. So you can see videos on YouTube of parents smothering their child with a pillow or their hand while the doctor is out of the room. And then when the child passes out, the parent goes running off and calls in the medical staff because they envy that attention. It's a sick thing, but that's what people do because of their envy. We hurt those that we love by neglecting them in the pursuit of something we envy also. Sometimes we are envious of another person's career success. We know somebody else at work that got the promotion we didn't. And so we want to work to get their same kind of success or better than because we envy that success. Sometimes we work tirelessly and recklessly. We neglect our family. We don't spend time with our spouse. We don't spend time with our kids because we're so driven by our envy of that career success we don't have. In that way, envy destroys families and marriages and childhoods. Here's the next point. Envy hurts us also. Joseph's brothers almost kill the one who in the end saves them from starvation, as the story goes on. Joseph goes down to Egypt as a slave, and he ends up number 2 to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And because he does, he is able to save his brothers when a famine hits their land and they almost starve. Our envy hurts us when we neglect our health in order to pursue something that we think we need. We are tempted not to take care of ourselves because we are envious and we want to achieve a certain goal. I remember when I was a hospital chaplain up in Naperville, this was a long time ago. There was a man who came in. He was a very, very successful, wealthy lawyer in town. But he had taken such poor care of himself. He had drank himself too much. He had smoked too much. He was in terrible shape. And he was probably in his late 40s. And he had a heart attack. And he died. And I sat there and talked with his family. I watched his mother as she grieved. And they were saying, you know, he completely neglected himself in order to achieve this success because of his envy of that idolatry of success. So when we are envious, it hurts us also. The last point I want to make is that envy arises from the mistaken perception that God has not given us enough so that we can be happy. It wasn't enough for Joseph's brothers to be relatively wealthy by their standards. They were. It wasn't enough, though. It wasn't enough to know that God had promised to preserve them. It wasn't enough that God had said, I will give you this land that you can live on. It wasn't enough. They took matters into their own hands that they knew were to be left in God's hands because of their envy. Envy is that little voice inside of us that convinces us Jesus isn't right. When he says, seek first the kingdom of God, and all of these things will be given to you. Instead, envy says to us, you only live once. You don't want to sit around waiting for God to give you what you want. You need to go out there and take it for yourself. You deserve it. You're entitled to it. Why should that person over there have it and you not have it? You're better than him or her. Why doesn't God see that? Are you going to sit around and wait for God to notice how good you are? Or are you going to be the master of your own destiny? Joseph's brothers tried to get rid of the competition because they were envious of it. And they found out that they were not the masters of their own destiny. The world is larger than them and their envy. God is larger than them and their envy. I've got a couple of points that I want to say about dealing with our tendency towards envy. One of the things that you can do is to challenge yourself to think and reflect on whether or not you really believe what you say. When you say that God will provide, that God will take care of you, do you really believe that? Think of the situations this morning in your life that worry you the most, the things that you were laying up worrying about last night on the bed. Do you really trust God not to solve, but to be the master over those situations? Do you trust God to give you what you need in order to be able to deal with those situations? Are you worried because it's something that you really need? Or are you stressed because it's something you feel you should be entitled to but aren't getting? The second thing I want to say about this is allow yourself to be driven first and foremost in life by your love for God and for your neighbor. If Reuben had done this, he would have shut down this ridiculous attempt to kill his brother. And Judah would have done the same thing. If we are driven by our respect for human dignity and value, we will see the blind spots in our consciousness where we have allowed envy to drive our actions. Those little envy-driven shortcuts are out there. And we don't always recognize them. We don't see them coming. As I was reading through this passage, I found a commentary by a rabbi. And he said something interesting. He said what Judah should have done when they were thinking about selling him into slavery. Judah should have picked Joseph up out of that pit. He should have put him on his shoulder and carried him home. He should have known that this envy of Jacob's attention was wrong. He should have known that this plot was wrong. He should have known that making his father suffer for favoring Joseph was wrong. And he should have expected God's justice in return. And Judah made the choice to follow his envy instead. This morning, this week, we will have choices to make in our life. Too many of the choices that we make are influenced by envy. The sense that God can't be trusted. That we need to game the system in our own favor. Instead of being driven by envy, try this week to be driven by your sense of what is good, what is right, what honors God, what honors the dignity that God has given all of us. Because you never know, in that time, that Joseph that you saved may end up saving you too. Let's pray.